Welcome back to another video, folks. In this episode I will be showing you how I'm going to make a IS-2, which is going to be the command vehicle for my heavy assault gun company. Now I've been using all the normal kind of tools that you probably be familiar with to get these things prepared, ready for gluing. Just remember, these things are all sharp. The more force you apply when using them, the more damage you'll do either to the kit or to your fingers if you make a mistake. So be careful, especially when you're like removing sprue gates on the edges of these fenders, for instance. You can very easily dig into the figure or dig into your finger. I'll also be using a toothbrush. You'll see what that's all about soon enough. I've got a bit of sprue that I've cut off here. That's going to become the unditching log. And I've got a couple of other things I'm going to be doing. Because this is a command tank, I want to just go a little bit further with it. I wouldn't go to this length for a whole company of IS-2s, but I'm going to be adding a weld bead to the turret. As you can see, it's pretty featureless here, but there was a prominent weld bead, and it's got a cast surface. Now it's quite rough, a common thing in Soviet tanks. So I'm going to be using some Tamiya thin cement and this old toothbrush to achieve that. I've been practicing on the underside of the hull and on the track. And as you point out, folks, as you'll see, this is a cast look, not a really rough in your face kind of look. So I'm going to make a start by assembling the various components. The tracks will be kept off so I can paint them separately. As you can see, there's a hell of a lot of visible track underneath the fender there, and you don't want to be trying to get your brush in. So it's just as easy to keep them separate and then apply them, stick them in when the painting's all done. So I'm just going to go on to some gluing, and I'll speed up the camera for that, and then we'll come back to show the particular little details I'm going to try and add to the finished look. Starting with assembly then, folks. I'm not attaching the barrel to the turret to begin with, because I'll be doing some work on it. As always, a bit of dry fitting always helps. I'm using some Tamiya cement here. Just make sure you have enough glue and not too much on the brush. Fits really good on these kits. Just push things together, make sure they're in the right place and that the gaps are minimal. Get longer objects such as the bottom of the hull perfectly lined up with the top, and then check you've actually used the correct part, because here I used the wrong hull top. Also, I filed down the back of the spare track a little bit to make a more surface contact, and here we go. I'll go, oops, my goodness, let's just fix that. These kits are very well made for wargaming, by the way, folks. Are so easy to put together. You've got the big bathtub hull there, very simple connection points, and everything matches up really quite nice with no worrying gaps. Make sure you get your filler caps in the right orientation on your spare, well, on your fuel tanks, folks. They've got to be pointing up the way. And now we go back to the turret to add a little bit more character. I'm going to be using Tamiya thin cement here. This is a good cement to melt the surface of the figure. I'm working in small areas and I'm making sure I'm happy with the result. So letting it dry and then going back to it. This is speeded up, so it looks as though I'm going really quick, but I'm giving it just a little bit of time for the cement to do its thing. I'm not leaving it for too long. But that ultimately all comes down to how rough you want the finished look to be, and I'm not entirely sure what the finished look is going to be, so I'm being careful here. So you can always come back and do more, but it's hard to remove excessive roughness. But you can see I've gone around various areas here, back and forward, until I've made gradual changes to get the surface looking the way that I want to. That's the rough texture of the cast hull sides finished. If there's any little bits that are annoying you, you can just hack away at them with a knife and just knock them down a bit. But you can see the nice contrast between the rough surface of the sides and the smooth surface of the top plates. Now we're on to the weld seams, and I've used 0.3mm plastic rod for this. I started by gluing a section along the line that I want the weld seam to go. It pretty much matches where the two parts of the turrets join, and that'll, now that it's dry, allow me to shape it up to the front where it joins the mantlet, which I'll do just now. And then, see if I can keep this on camera without screwing it up. I'll just adjust that a bit. Let me think. Okay. And then I'm going to cut it off. There we go. I quite like the look of that. We'll quickly do the other side, and then we'll have to knock it up so it looks like a weld seam. Now you can see this is very round looking, very neat and tidy, and we want it to be a lot flatter looking. I'm not necessarily trying to create a surface of a weld at this scale. We don't have to go crazy, but I'm carefully applying more of the thin cement, and then just pushing it down, biting into it a little bit with the edge of the blade. Be very careful that I'm not destroying the surface around it, because this stuff's really quite strong, folks, even though it's thin. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to apply a careful amount, work in sections, and then start pushing it down, flattening it out, making sure it doesn't go wandering. And this is going to take a few passes to get it looking like this one here. So I'll just carry on with that. I'm going to use a rotary tool to get the surface I want on the unditching log. As before, folks, with the other tools, this thing's sharp, it goes really fast, so if you're using one of these, be careful. I have glued the unditching log here on the fender. I've not put it on the other side because there's more going on there and we don't want to be covering it up and it wouldn't sit easily on there. I've also glued one of these two boxes that you get with the kit. You might want to consider when you're applying these little boxes, you don't necessarily want to have every single tank in your platoon with exactly two boxes. You know, change things about, keep them looking different. I've mixed up a little bit of, if I can get it in shot, a little bit of green stuff here. I'm going to make a rolled up tarpaulin. Right, and you notice I've got the tank turret on just so that I can be confident it can make some basic movements for use in the game. So, rolled up tarpaulins. This is a really quick and easy way of doing it. Just going to take this lump of green stuff, stick it on top of that box. I'm going to get a little bit of water onto my hobby knife, square the ends off. The water stops the green stuff sticking to the knife. Right, and then I'm going to draw a straight line underneath like that. Then go to the ends, and from that straight line start cutting a little spiral. Just be careful, the green stuff is soft, and as I'm pushing in to create this spiral, I'll be forcing that side of the lump away, so you have to do a bit of squaring up as you go. Now I'm going to create the tie downs, and I'm just cutting 2 pairs of thin lines into the little lump that we've got there, and then carrying those thin lines down onto the bottom portion, like the bit that's tucked underneath, lifting up the top bit so it looks a bit more like a fold or a flap off material hanging over the bottom, using the corner of the knife there that you can see to make little binding marks in the fabric. Checking the turret, see if it's more or less in the right place. And then green stuff is great for adding extra bits of stowage, because you can just push it in to the green stuff and it'll sit there very securely. Time for a bit more character. I think you see a lot of pictures of IS-2s and ISUs with damaged or removed fenders. It looks quite nice. So I've just carefully snipped off the corner there, just the one, using the Tamiya thin cement again just to smooth down any exposed edges. Checking the track underneath to see what's exposed, and there's a little bit of the support that needs to come off. It runs along the top of the track, contacts the hull. So I'm just removing that, and once again a bit of thin cement to smooth it over, and there we go. We're now ready for painting. I'm ready to start airbrushing. One more point on the weld line. I felled it down just a little bit because it was still a little bit too big. It seemed quite resilient to the plastic cement, that little plastic rod. But there we go, that's it in place. Ready to go. I've kept the tracks separate. If I was doing a whole platoon, then I would airbrush these, my base track colour, before airbrushing the green I'm going to use for the tank. And as you'll see, I use US Olive Drab as my base track colour, but I'm going to just paint that on in this case. But otherwise I will spray it with the green colour for the tank. But before I start airbrushing, I always use some airbrush cleaner. I recommend this, folks. I don't go out of my way to recommend products, but this is brilliant. This is a Vallejo airbrush cleaner. I take the needle out the airbrush, give it a clean, use a cleaning rod to clean out the channel for the airbrush. Only clean the nozzle if I have to, and you'll know that you have to because you've been experiencing some problems. And then put it in, put a blast of this through, and that'll give you a good idea how it's flowing. And I always leave a tiny little amount of this so that it's kind of filling the space between the nozzle and the cavity where you put the paint. That helps you make sure you're getting a right mixture of paint into the cavity and stops any unmixed paint getting in there. This is what I'm going to be using to thin the paints. I find this is really good for Vallejo. I've only really used Vallejo or Tamiya. For Tamiya I use their dedicated thinner, but for Vallejo I use this, and it's brilliant. So the colours I'll be using, this is quite a dark palette I'm going to be applying here. We've got German Camo Dark Green. That'll be the shade colour. Then the main colour is, Camouflage Olive Green. And the highlight colour being Medium Olive. And this will be applied in a, let's call it modulation, but it's really going to be a shade coat, a main coat and a highlight with soft transitions between them, whereas modulation is something a little more complex with many more steps. We're keeping it nice and simple, but it'll give a nice bit of shadows and highlights. Now normally I use an airbrush booth and a mask. I'm not going to set the booth up for this because it's just going to be a quick bit of spraying, and it'll make it easier for me to film this without the booth. But I would recommend, if you're going to be airbrushing, always use your mask. Get yourself an airbrush booth with a hose that will reach a window, so you can properly exhale the fumes, and leave it running a bit after you have finished spraying as well, because there'll be, even though it's got a fan to pull the paint particles out, there'll still be some floating around, and if you've got a sensitive nose you will pick up on that. So leave it running for a bit to just try and clear the last of the fumes out. But I am ready to get started, folks. So this is noisy, the airbrush compressor that you can't see. It's noisy, so I'll be talking over this and explaining what I'm doing as I go, as opposed to trying to talk over the compressor. I've not applied a primer here. I'm only doing one tank, so I want to save a bit of time, but a primer would be recommended if you're going to be doing a lot of tanks. I'm putting on my base colour here of German Camo Dark Green. I'm not going to cover how I thin the paint too much. All I'll say is that there's a well in the bottom of my painting, my airbrush cup. I fill that with thinner, put sufficient drops, because each drop's different that comes out of each bottle, folks. So just a sufficient drops so that it is roughly 50-50 visually, but in the end it's probably going to have more thinner in it, and take my time to do as many passes as needed. Remember to work in thin coats, folks. Go back and forward till you've got the final result. Don't just try and do it all in a winner. Now here we're using the main colour, which is Camouflage Olive Green. I'm just picking out individual wheels there, and then moving on to the hull. This is where we've got to be a lot more careful, being careful that we want to create the modulation here, so we want to be using masking if you feel it's required, or overspray, being careful with your overspray, so that you're pointing on the top of an edge, so you go any spray goes over the top of that edge and not onto flat surfaces. But this takes a lot of patience. You want to build this up so you've got a nice gradation of colour from your dark up towards your light. Remember, this is our main colour. This is what we want to see most of when we have the finished result. And there's a lot of thin areas you can see, like the top of the hull, over the running board there, for instance. Along the edges, there's not of the running boards, there's not a lot of area to work off in certain bits of this tank, but we want to make sure that we are just hitting the right spots and leaving that shade colour. You'll see me going back over the same areas when I'm doing this. As I said, it takes more than one coat to get this on right. Remember, when you're airbrushing, it's a fairly semi-opaque layer that you're putting on. So when I go back, especially on panels, on the sides of the turret for instance, I will on subsequent passes focus more on the top where I want it to be lighter and less in the mid or lower areas. You can see going over the same areas again, building up the colour. And the turret, now the turret's got a lot of little areas on it that we want to accentuate. There I was using a little base for masking. I also find post-its are good for masking, but in this case the base fitted really quite nicely into panel lines and such likes, and it was a very solid piece of masking that had no glue and wasn't going to bend under the pressure of the air. And see me on the edges just shooting past the edge so we're not getting overspray running all the way down the panel. The airbrush compressor was walking across the table at that point, folks. I had to push it back and then working the top of the turret sides. You might also see me cleaning the nozzle from time to time. I do get sometimes I do get paint drying on the nozzle, and that's a big problem that you don't want to have to deal with. So if you see it happening, deal with it there and then clear it and carry on. And that's the main colour. For highlight we're using medium olive, and we're going to take the same approach, except we're going to apply just to the lightest areas of the tank. So the tops of panels, the front end of features, edges of hatches. Then you're going to see the, if I can keep it in place, the masking going on again. And you can see how quick that is. If you're masking a lot of tanks, you want something quick. But there you can see the modulation that we're after, or call it highlighting and shading. Now along the edges, again, of fenders, being careful. If we overdo this, the highlight colour is going to become the main colour, and we don't want that. That's me cleaning the nozzle again. Hitting that top edge is really tricky. Make sure you're overshooting, so you're not spraying flat onto it, you're spraying up to it. Your airbrush is pointing up the way towards it, or it's at an angle to your airbrush. And then just little spots here and there to accentuate all these bright details. And we're getting pretty close, ready for the washing, which will give it some nice depth. And you can also use your thumb, by the way, as a good masking, very quick and effective masking tool. And there you go, folks. Having finished the airbrushing, I completed the painting of the tracks, and this is really easy. Just a coat of the US olive drab and then a dry brush. So much simpler than painting German wheels, for instance, with so many rubber tyres, or even Shermans for that matter. If there is a little bit of paint ended up on these wheels, I'm not too fussed because my weathering is going to cover it. But if you see any really bad bits of dry brush, for instance the silver going onto the wheels or the olive drab, give it a quick fix with the mid-tone. It's probably best to do it with the mid-tone paint that we used for the spray painting. I then varnished these with some gloss varnish, and varnished the tank as well. I gloss varnish these as soon as I've got the dry brush of metallics on the tracks, because this metallic paint lifts off very easily, and if you're contacting them, especially if you're working with the tracks in place, and if you touch an unvarnished bit of dry brushed metallics and then touch anywhere else on the figure, paint will transfer. So I do the varnishing straight away. Now hopefully it's coming across that the gloss varnish has darkened down the finish, and you'll find that with gloss varnish, with Vallejo at least. But we'll address that in the next stage after the pin wash. Now, the pin wash is going to darken it down again. You know, so this is where you've got to give consideration to what layers you're adding on top and on top and on top. Each thing will potentially darken things down. For instance, if you were to apply a filter to this, like a brown filter, let's say, chances are it will look darker once again. You could put a bright green filter on, or I find it works really good for figures that you don't want to necessarily brighten too much, and it works good with German three-tone camo where you don't want to darken it too much, is a grey filter. That might sound a bit daft, but a grey filter actually does really good job of brightening things up without oversaturating. And also another thing is, I don't use a filter because of the darkening down, but the gloss varnish and then the pin wash and then subsequent weathering, it's all going to give the effect that a filter will do anyway, which is changing the tone, unifying the surfaces and such likes. So this is now ready for us to do the pin wash. I'm going to be using enamel pin washes for this, folks. There are, whoops, get on screen. There's lots and lots of products out there. I'm using this for the running gear and this for the hull. This is a dark wash, almost black, and this is a brown wash. They're all very different, the kind of washes you can get out there, folks. I'm not going to recommend one over the other. I normally find myself just choosing a dark wash for pretty much every 15mm cut kit that I paint, and a brown wash for the running gear. You may have some of your own ideas. Giving us a good shake, folks. You know, the paint will settle. And once we've done that, we'll be ready to go. The blue tack, by the way, you may have seen this in other videos, is to secure the pot. You can't knock it over, but you've got to really clobber it to do so, and that will stand up to normal kind of painting. Washing the running gear, really simple. Taking an old knackered brush. This bottle, giving it a good shake, but it's still really thin. Hopefully that's coming across. And then just evenly apply it across the hull, return rollers and drive sprockets, main wheels. So you can just slap it on, just get it all around. You don't necessarily want every wheel to look exactly the same as the next, because what we're doing here is weathering, and it's not an even process. Just don't apply too much paint at one time. And then get right around these wheels, folks. So you've not got any overly bright surfaces. A quick check to see if everything looks okay. You can lift off any excess, add more as required. And then when it comes time for these to dry, lie them flat, otherwise the paint's just all going to run to the bottom of the wheels and the bottom of the lower hull. If your tank is assembled, we'll just lie the whole tank on one side, and then after a little while turn it over another side, and that will help keep the enamel paint drying. And I typically leave these for a full day to dry, especially when you're putting a large amount of enamel paint on like this. It's not the same as working with acrylics. So I'll do the other track, and then we're on to the hull and the turret. So the dark wash, I need that plus a little bottle of thinner. That's to help prepare it and to clean the wash after it's applied, and also clean your brushes, folks. You'll need the thinner to clean your brushes. So to get started, I'm using my palette. I'm not working straight from the bottle. Just using the brush to lift out what I think I'll need for one batch. Clean the gunk off the brush there, it's going to go all over your fingers. And then I take some thinner. I'm lifting it out with this big flat brush. And then some spare thinner as well. And then mix this up. And hopefully that's coming across for how thin that actually is, folks. That's much, much more thin than you'll see in the bottle. And if you use it out of the bottle, you'll get much more contrasting shading applied. So it's a matter, comes down to a matter of taste, really. So let's start with the hull. And I normally hit the areas that need to be darkest first, such as grills. Now remember, I painted some black into these really, really deep grills, and that will help this shading process. I'm not having to be too careful at this point. There's going to be highlighting applied over the top of the grills. Okay, now we can see sort of pin wash in effect. So that this paint has got lots of thinner in it, which means it's got a low surface tension, and you'll see it just flowing around the features we want to shade. I'm carefully applying the wash over an area that I can manage. By that I mean I can apply it, clean things up, and then go back and tidy up. I don't let the whole thing dry for 15 minutes as you'll see in other tutorials. I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, it's just from experience I find that I get lighter results, a lighter overall finish if I apply it and then start to draw it back into the recesses or draw it off the brush altogether. That's just a personal approach that I take, and you see I'm not afraid to use my fingers as well. Sometimes it's easier just to scrape it off. As you probably see during these videos, my fingers become quite messy. I wash my hands quite a lot. See, I'm just, with some thinner, I'm just pulling it back into the recesses, pulling it off the flat areas where I don't want them to be dark. And this also, to a degree, acts as a filter. I don't use filters as a matter of course because I find they can darken things down. So this is a good substitute. The enamel wash has dried. It's always best to give it plenty of time to dry. The next day is the best option, but otherwise a good 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. Just depends how much you've put on, I suppose. If it's not dry, then you'll get a bad interaction with the acrylic paint. So best to be cautious. We're now going to do some fading. I'm going to be using the highlight colour, which was this medium olive, and Glaze medium. Glaze medium is it's a medium that helps us work paint on the figure, so that means it's also a bit of a paint retarder, and I find it works really good for this stage. I've done it without the glaze medium before, and you have to work really quick, and really careful you get it right first time. This gives you a lot of elbow room. So we're just going to tip out a bit of this onto the palette and a bit of our paint. Give the bottle a good shake. There we go. And I'm going to use a small but worn out brush for this, folks. It's quite hard going on the bristles, and if you've got a good brush you don't want to wreck it doing this, because we're going to be doing, the brush is going to be wet, really wet a lot, which tends to splay the hairs. So we're making sure we've got everything we need ready. Excuse the hair coming in there, folks. We'll paint a little line on. You notice something, it's settled just a little bit. Taking the excess paint and moisture off my brush and then just drawing the paint in the direction I want it to go to create streaking. But bear in mind, where your brush finishes the stroke will be where the majority of paint remains. That's where it will leave it, so you may have to draw the line up the way as well as down the way, and then strengthen as required by adding in a bit more paint, or perhaps draw some more off by adding a bit more water or glaze medium to the brush. And you can already see that starting to take shape there in that panel. And then you can work the hatch, just for instance on the top edge of the hatch there. You're accentuating any shading or highlighting on it around the edge of the turret top, pushing the paint back towards that edge. And you can see how we're starting to get some depth now, picking up these detailed areas too. And you've got a bit of time to work it because of the glaze medium, but you've not got all day, so don't leave an area until you've got it the way you want it. Then on to the side of the turret, slab-sided tanks are really good for this look. Just repeating the process. The hull's quite a complex area, so you're going to be working flat areas as well as sloped areas. So just make sure you're getting the highlights where you would want them to go, using the modulation as a guide. Follow it, do some streaking off the back of it, but make sure you don't work the very big object. Don't work at all, work small areas at a time. Then review what you've done. I felt the turret in areas went from far too much light to too much dark. There was not enough air transition. So I've gone back in with the Camo olive green and removed some of the medium olive that I've been using for the highlight colour. I don't know if I mentioned it, medium olive is a highlight colour. And if there's anywhere that's also just a bit too dark on those flat areas, use that medium olive again, just to make a bit more of a transition. Now it's looking a lot softer. Just working the side of the turret as well. It's a bit of a organic process where it just kind of, you follow your own results, so to speak, and think, oh, a bit more there, a bit less here, and keep working until you've got it looking the way you want. I'm moving on to edge highlighting, and here I start with what I call the external edges. These are areas where any old rough old brush that isn't completely knackered, you'll be able to draw along those edges and leave a bit of the highlight colour, which is just the medium olive again. You notice it's starting to really frame the panel lines, especially where you're putting up against a dark area of the panel. And as I said, I'm just working areas where I can just very quickly rub a bit of paint over the edge, and the brush will do all the work for us. There's lots of smaller areas where, as you see, I'll move on to a smaller brush for that. Internal areas need a detail brush, and all those little points of detail like hinges and such like, they all need that detail brush, because we want to be drawing a nice solid line here. Picking out rivets, things like that, you know, to just help them pop out of the background. We're not using an overly bright colour here, remember, we're just using our medium olive, which is the highlight colour. But as we're applying it all solidly, as opposed to as a wash or an airbrush, it catches the eye. And you can see this rear panel, you know, there's so much going on there. You can really help define that with a few careful, thinly drawn lines of paint. Now on to scratching. This is also going to help highlight the tank. You see I'm using a thin brush. I'm using olive green, which is a lighter shade again, and it's probably not coming across incredibly strongly how these lines are going on, and that's because we're after something quite subtle. We're not going crazy. Excuse the hairy bonds there, folks. This is quite a lengthy process, so you need to be patient. If you go mad and put scratches absolutely everywhere, and don't follow the kind of natural wear that you might see on a tank, such as edges, hatches, pronounced details and so on, you're going to end up with something that looks as though it should be in a scrapyard. You just want to hit edges, break up larger panels. Same goes for the turret. We can accentuate details, hit those edges again, especially hit corners. There might be wear on a corner just because it's exposed. Then you see little lines getting drawn across the modulation, across the streaking. It helps soften everything and bring it together. Some wear on the front of the turret there. Perhaps it's been taken a few hits from various things around the edges of the mantlet, really helping to make that whole detail pop out. Turrets as well. The brighter edge again is going to help it stand out against the rest of that flat panel. We're going to use German Camo black brown to fill in the centre of those larger chips. This is representing somewhat rusted, exposed metal underneath. Adds a bit more depth to what you're seeing, as well as tones down what you've done. Provided you haven't gone crazy, it's a good way of toning down excessive chipping. Now we're adding some dusting and dust streaks. We're using light, mud and glaze medium, and we're going to be using very small thin amounts. As you can see, the size of that dot is tiny, but we're drawing it down, drawing it up on the hull, making sure it's going in the direction that gravity would make it flow. Make sure our brush is cleaned of any excess, and that's it, folks. You know, that's a streak. That's as much as you need. We don't want it looking like some kind of zebra. Same for the hull there. The glaze medium will help us keep it working. Look at areas on the tank that would gather dust and it would run off. That'll give you a nice natural look. You can also apply a layer of dust around certain areas that perhaps wouldn't be trod on or worn. This can be a nice effect, but be careful, be subtle as much as you can. Add a little, work it, and then go and add some more. Don't try and get the finished result straight away. There we go again, working up, working down, following gravity, keeping it nice and subtle. Cleaning excess off on my fingers, as you can see. Helps add to the streakiness of it, and that's always attractive in itself, but also helps soften the modulation too. And you can see me adding a little bit more heavy dust around certain areas to help them catch the eye. You can, how to put it, you can almost shade with a light colour. by placing that on a dark surface, place that light paint in there, like a wash, like dust, a dust wash, and you've added a bit of shape to the overall look. Then the hull, it's a much larger area, work it very carefully, don't go crazy, less is more. And you can see the light streaks there. I'll add to that with the next stage of the weathering, but keeping it subtle, let's not go crazy. I'm creating a thick sludge of dark brown pigment as the initial layer for the tracks. As you see, it's still a wash. It's not like a paste. Make sure it's thin enough to wash on and apply it all over the surface of the track. Once that's dry, I'm mixing up some lighter pigment and I'm going to apply that as a thinner wash over the darker areas. I'm going to let that dry again, and later I'll be able to work that to mix it a little and get a nice soft overall look. I'm going to use the same thin wash of light pigments to line some panels in the lower hull area. You can see me just using it to accentuate, very carefully accentuate certain areas where dust would accumulate, where earth would be thrown up and perhaps dry. Not putting it on too heavy, being careful to wash off the excess straight away by cleaning the brush and then just removing it. And you can also create some streaks with this too, so that'll help accentuate the lighter dust streaks to go with the darker hull streaks. You know, we're creating a nice sort of patina. But just keep working around until you're happy with the finished look, because it's very difficult to go back when pigments are dry and get them looking the way that you want. Don't forget the underside of the hull, guys. I'm going to put some nice dark pigments in there, sort of rough streaking. We don't have to worry too much as long as it isn't forgotten about and missed completely. Then it might catch the eye, otherwise just get it looking right. I've applied an undercoat of German Camo black brown over all the stowage. I'm giving the unditching log a dry brush of US Field Drab. That is also going to be the first colour for the crates. Don't have to be particularly careful here, just make sure you stay off the hull. We don't want to have to repaint anything, though if you do make a mistake, just weather it, make it look as though it's deliberate. And then follow the panel lines on the box. Where there are none, you can paint them in, like on the sides for instance, make up for any lack of detail. And just keep the shade, the deepest shade in the deepest areas, and that will help really define the shape of the box as we're progressing. And then we're using Panzer Ace's old wood here, leaving some of that Field Drab as additional shade, carefully painting those lines of wood on the boxes, those little planks, and then another dry brush onto the unditching log. And then we're going to finish the unditching log with some deck tan. It's a less saturated kind of colour than perhaps like a sandy kind of colour, which works good for the log. And then back to old wood for the ends, the cut ends of the log, looking like the heartwood, so to speak. And then some Iraqi stand to highlight the boxes. And the tie downs that you can see, I painted just with browns, and a little bit of sort of highlight, just to make them pop against the background of the log and the rolled up tarpaulin that you can see here. Now I'm using green grey with a highlight of deck tan for that, and I'm just following the sculpting that we did earlier on in the video. You can use an intermediate colour if you want, such as US Olive Drab, if you don't want the deep shadow of the Gemma Camo Black Brown. So here's the finished tank, folks. I actually lost some of the files for the last couple of stages on this, mainly covering such things as the spare tracks. My computer's acting up, as is my hard drive that I keep clips in. But there you go, you can hopefully see the modulation we've got, the streakiness, the nice bright stowage that's on there, a nice streaky look to the front of the hull, nicely weathered. And you can also see I've got a commander in there now. I didn't film that, but that's Panzer AC's Russian Tank Crew 1 plus Russian Tank Crew 1 highlight. A black undercoat's been applied for the uniform areas. But that's it all coming together. Hopefully that's a look you might want to try yourself, and a few techniques you want to try yourself. There is one of the platoons that's going to be in the force. It's painted really differently. I've gone really heavy on the weathering. To be honest, probably too heavy on the weathering. But, you know, live and learn. Try different things. You can see the heavy dusting on the tops of the superstructure there. That's all been done with the dusting technique I was showing you in this video, as was the streaking on the side to a large extent, but done a little bit more heavily, as you can see, than on here. It looks a really quite different approach. This is heavily weathered and just sort of like accents for the weathering. And these guys as well, you can see, for instance, this guy here has had his fenders completely removed with some Vallejo earth effects added as mud. He's just got some removed, and you can see again how, excuse me, you can get some nice streaky weathering effects, once again just done with some pigment powder, but mainly with the dusting approach with the glaze medium. Sorry about that, folks. I couldn't get the words out as always. But there you go. That's my, well, a couple of platoons, a couple of elements for my heavy Soviet assault guns. I'll get them on the table pretty soon. So if you want to stay tuned for the battle reports, I'll be using them in a few games, see how they go. They hit hard, but you know, like, there's so much German stuff out there that can take them out. I don't know if they're going to survive very long, but the painting is something that can survive. Obviously, you can enjoy them game after game after game, so hopefully this will give you a few ideas about how you want to do yours. Thanks for watching, folks. Please stay tuned, please like, subscribe, do all the good things that helps me build the channel, because I've got more of these kind of videos in the pipeline for you.